I'm going to go ahead and introduce each of the state senators that are on the stage, and then we'll let them each make a few opening comments, and then as we did in the past, in this last session, we'll open it up to questions. You kind of see the process now. If you have a question, go ahead and make yourself to one of the microphones, and we'll certainly try to get that answered. We do thank the state senators for being here. I know there's a number of other state senators here that are here as well, and we're particularly interested in the feedback that you've heard from constituents as you complete your work. I'll go ahead, as I mentioned, and introduce all of the senators before you. Second from the left here is the Speaker of the Legislature, Senator Greg Adams of York. Senator Adams was elected as Speaker in early 2013 and serves as Chairman of formerly served as the Chairman of the Legislature's Education Committee for 4 years. On the end, your right is Senator Galen Hadley of Kearney, who serves as the Chairman of the Tax Modernization Committee and is also Chairman of the Legislature's Revenue Committee. Senator Paul Schumacher, second from your left, from Columbus, is the Vice Chair of the Revenue Committee and also the author of the original tax study legislation. Right in the middle is Senator Heath Mello of Omaha, who is the Chair of the Legislature's Appropriations Committee, which decides how your tax dollars are spent. And on the your far left, is Senator Beau McCoy of Omaha, a key figure in tax reform discussion. Earlier this year, the tax reform measure was his priority legislation in the 2013 session. I think to start, it would be appropriate to ask Senator Hadley to come to the podium and give us an update on both the Tax Modernization Committee and also any findings they might have to date. Senator Hadley.
Good morning. My wife told me to wear a red tie so that if you shoot me, I won't show any blood up here. This was a hard session for me. Do you know, like riding a bicycle? When you start riding a bicycle, you have training wheels. Then eventually you have to take your training wheels off and ride it alone. Well, I spent 4 years having Senator Fisher tell me how to vote. And this was the first year she wasn't there to tell me how I was supposed to vote every day. So it was a real learning experience for me. We've had 4 experts in, and I call them neutral experts, that have tried to give us background on, what a modern tax system looks like. We've also spent some time looking at our own tax system to see how it compares with what we think a modern tax system should look like. And we've come up with some takeaways. And I just want to give you a couple of the takeaways that I have gotten from these experts. The first one, every expert has talked about, and it's important to you, is that we must be very careful not to tax, especially from a sales tax standpoint, business inputs, manufacturing inputs, and ag inputs. They, to a person, have talked about pyramiding of taxes. The idea of putting tax on tax on tax. We have to be very, very careful about that. We have not done a good job of explaining that business taxes are passed on to the consumer. They're an expense of doing business. If you have a sales tax on an input, if you're a good business person, your job is to pass that tax on to the consumer as the expense of your business. For some reason, people think of businesses almost in an evil way, that they're somehow trying to get around paying taxes. I truly believe that businesses don't pay taxes. The consumers pay taxes, employees pay taxes, owners pay taxes, but the businesses themselves try to pass those taxes on to other people. So anything we can do to hold down businesses or taxes on transactions involving businesses will ultimately impact the consumer in lower prices for goods and services. The second thing I wanted to mention to you, we're not the only committee that's working right now. There are two other committees that I think you need to really keep an eye on, because they're going to impact, I think, the way revenue is received and spent in the state of Nebraska. The first one is the Water Sustainability Task Force by Senator Carlson that is looking at water sustainability in Nebraska and what we need to do in the future to make sure we have the water we need. This could, I'm going to speculate, this is going to come down to who pays for the water the state of Nebraska needs. And I'm going to give you the question, is this a statewide responsibility or is this a local responsibility to pay for the water that Nebraska needs? That's a question I think we're going to have to deal with. The second question, there's another study group, Senator Kate Sullivan, the chair of the Education Committee, is looking at the school aid formula. I'm going to be very frank, the concerns we consistently hear from our constituents are about property taxes. And they are directly related to TIOSA. We're spending between 900 million and $1 billion now on school aid. There are people that think we should shift more from the local level to the state level to do that. So you should keep your eyes on those two committees because they could certainly impact the revenue we get in Nebraska and what we spend. Lastly, we appreciate your input. We're trying to do the best job we can. I applaud the governor for moving ahead with this, getting us to look at it. He's just done a great job in focusing us on this concern. So we're going to spend what we can do and get the best heads together to come up with what we can do to help Nebraska continue to grow in the future. And one last thing, and it was brought home in a conversation yesterday. We can't just be concerned about what our tax policy looks like next year. We've got to be concerned what our tax policy looks like 20 years from now, 25 years from now. We can make decisions now that may look good now, but we've got to live with them. We had an expert from Georgia that put together a committee to change their tax policy, and they came up with a lot of ideas, but then it entered the political realm, and they were unable to get most of them done. So we've got to be careful what we do to impact Nebraska in the future. Thank you so very much.
Well, good morning. The other day I was looking at my schedule and realized that I had to be here, and then I looked at this group, and they kicked me off of this group mid-session somewhere, so I wasn't quite sure why I needed to be here. But nonetheless, I appreciate the opportunity to get to say a couple of things. I think what the legislature is doing right now with this, and it will be a focus of this next session on the agenda, is critical. But something I think we all need to think about, and maybe it's just me. When I chaired the Education Committee, there wasn't a single year when I didn't hear from one end of the state to the other, it's too complicated, it's too complex, it's not fair. I'm talking about state aid, not taxes. And there wasn't a year where there weren't new members that came onto the committee, energized to change the formula, which was fine, as long as you knew what you were doing first. Did you understand why we even have a distribution formula for state aid? Do you understand the history of its evolution? Once that was done, more than willing to address different things about that formula. And the reason I use that example, not only because state aid to schools is a critical component in this whole thought process about property taxes, as well as sales and income, but it appears to me that if nothing else happens, and we all want something more to happen out of this tax study, but if nothing else happens, it should be an education that everybody in the legislature, besides the folks that are on this committee. The time I served on the Revenue Committee, 4 years, there wasn't a single legislative session where we didn't see a host of people lined up, 60, 70 bills introduced. I don't know what percentage of them. I'm going to speculate 50, 60% of those bills were sales tax exemptions. And maybe it was just me personally, but sitting there, trying to make a policy determination based on what? Who was there? Who the lobbyist was? What the year was? What the revenue picture looked like? Personally, I struggled for a rationale to do what we were doing. Now, what I'm saying to you is there needed to be an education. If we're going to grant a sales tax exemption, why are we doing it? From a broad policy perspective. That way, when you look at every one of them, you can decide whether it fits or not. And state aid to schools, and property tax, and its impact, and other aid programs, county aid, city aid, and the impact that it has. Do we understand why we even have those aid programs in the first place? I see what's going on right now with Senator Hadley's committee as first and foremost educational. And like you, I've watched. And it's been good. It's been foundational. More's going to come of it. How much? I don't know. What? I don't know. But more is going to come of it. But I think we're going about it the right way. We're beginning with an education, a foundation, and then moving forward from there. And I can assure you that this will be a focus of this next legislative session. As a matter of fact, maybe that's why I'm here. It's not because of any expertise I have. Maybe it's anticipation of refereeing what's going to happen on the floor next year. I don't know. But this is important. The host state's looking at it. Senator Hadley and his colleagues know that. I know that. And we're approaching it the right way, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry, for the opportunity to be here today. I'm the only one on the dais here who's not on the legislature's Revenue Committee. I the pleasure of serving as the chairman of the Appropriations Committee. And so I have a different perspective, let's say, in regards to how we're operating, I think, one, as a legislature, and two, as a member of the Tax Modernization Committee. As we've kind of gone through some initial dialogues in our first 3 or 4 meetings, it's become apparent from not just colleagues' conversations, but dialogues with some of the experts, that you don't do tax changes before you do spending changes. And I think that's very key as we continue to have this dialogue about modernizing our state's tax code, is that you don't build a revenue system and then figure out your spending. You do it the opposite way. And that's something that, if anything, that's conversations we've had before in the Appropriations Committee, but of late that really has been a sticking point that's come out in some of our Modernization Committee meetings. And I think that leads into kind of what we've seen, I think, in the legislature over the last 6 years. One, the legislature and the governor together, I think, has been able to help the state weather the Great Recession, economically as well as fiscally. Obviously, I think all of us have heard, and I agree, that Nebraska doesn't spend money we don't have. And I think that general fiscal philosophy has worked well for us. But as we've moved out of this Great Recession fiscally, our state still has an awful lot to be considerate as we move forward fiscally. Something that just recently has come about over the last couple of months is an issue of prison overcrowding. I know that doesn't really directly relate to how we're going to modernize our tax code, but I think when we're counting nickels, pennies, dimes, and dollars, if the issue gets brought up of building a $130 million new prison facility in comparison to how we modernize our tax code, those are big debates that the state is going to have. I, for one, don't want to see that happen, and I know a number of our other colleagues don't want to see that happen. But to deal with issues like that on the spending side, we need to be cognizant that we can't simply cut taxes and then figure out the spending decisions later, because really that's not good fiscal policy, because all of us, I think, in this room know our economy moves in cycles. And right now, as the state's moving out of the recession and moving in a recovery cycle, we will hit the top of that economic cycle and start moving our way down again towards the next recession. Something the legislature did prior to myself being elected was really put a focus on building the state's cash reserve, essentially the state's savings account. Prior to the Great Recession of 2008, the legislature and the governor made very significant decisions of holding spending growth and trying to build up a cash reserve with the thought that when the economy goes south, we don't want to have to raise taxes to maintain critical services like healthcare and education. Knowing that I would argue those two issues and those two policy areas control, give or take, about 75% of the state's budget. Prior to 2008, the legislature had a 17.3% savings of our cash reserve. With the good news that we've seen over the last session and some of the decisions that the members behind me and other members have made in regards to helping build our cash reserve, at the beginning of this fiscal year, we had a cash reserve at 16.9%. That's still not where we were at prior to the beginning of the Great Recession, but it's a pretty good number of where we're at. Understanding that education, K-12 higher ed, Medicaid, and corrections control overwhelmingly 70 to 85% of our budget at any given day. In relationship to tax policy, I think the members behind me who've been involved in the tax committee can agree that we've had some very good dialogues, very good conversations. There are areas that we need to modernize, both on our income tax side, our sales tax side, and our property tax side. The issue as we move forward, though, is setting expectations. The reality is that we won't see a big grand plan, I think, that will dramatically alter the tax landscape. But what we will do is something that I think is good fiscal policy, and it's good responsible tax policy. We've worked with the governor in the past in regards to making responsible changes, and I think that's where the committee ultimately is looking at right now, is moving forward with responsible changes, understanding that we have fiscal issues that we'll have to deal with in the future. So Ed, thank you so much for the opportunity.
After the first meeting of our Tax Modernization Committee, the Lincoln paper wrote an article, and I often find it interesting to look at the comments. It's often more informative than the article. And one of the comments said, "Look at that picture. 3 fat old guys trying to get into our pockets." And so I clicked on the picture. One of them was me. The truth hurts. Think about the problem that we confront. We've got to come up with, for state and local government, about $8,000 million a year. Wow. Now, our friends in Washington will print about $2,000 million for us, and thank you. And we've got to raise the rest from the people, 1.8 million people, 1.3 million adults, and a few corporations that live in the state and do business here. We've also got to fund a budget that at the state and local level, not too often there are people even show up at the budget hearings, and they are rubber stamped through the process at the county boards and the school boards and the city councils. And at the state level, there is general unanimity as to the nature of the budget. We got fringe discussions, sorry about the airplane, Governor, but basically on the bulk of that budget, there's agreement. So the idea that somehow we're going to magically slash a budget and therefore reduce taxes in any meaningful way is somewhat suspect. So how do we design a modern tax system? Well, what we've been looking at is the sales tax, the property tax, and income tax. What else really is there in substance? None of which are very modern. The property tax goes back to the Middle Ages. The Tea Party was about somewhat of a sales tax, and the income tax is 100 years old. Not modern about that. But we're going to struggle over the next few months and maybe a couple of legislative sessions as to how to move the shells on the table around between those three taxes while trying to promote economic growth, attract educated people with ability to the state, and still be fair to the residents in the state who make an average income of around $50,000 a year. That's a tough proposition. Fortunately, we live in a small state. Only 1.8 million people. Really, really small. Big land, very small population. And fortunately, the decision makers in this state are of goodwill, many of whom are in the audience today. I think that the trick is for us not to let the tax tail wag the business dog, but for us to figure out a way to make Nebraska and doing business in Nebraska profitable. You move to a state if you're in that well-educated category, not because you look at a marginal 1 or 2% on a tax, but because you can make money there and because there are other like-minded, like-skilled people in a close enough concentration to make the necessary connection to make us all successful. And it's a big order. A little bit of it is a tax angle that we're trying to struggle with. A much bigger part of it is the angle of the interrelationships between our various diverse communities and interests to make business profitable. Don't mind paying a 10% tax if I'm making $1 million a year. Much sooner do that than pay a 1% tax on $50,000 a year. And that's the trick, and that's our challenge. Thank you.
Well, I too want to say that it's a real honor to be here this morning, and I appreciate the opportunity not only to be part of this tax modernization committee, but be a member of the revenue committee. As a small business owner and as a state chamber member myself, my family and I operate a home improvement company, construction company in Omaha. You know, it's a challenge, as all of you know, to create and maintain jobs. And what more noble purpose is there than that? To work on the quality of life to make our state better. I know I don't need a whole lot more motivation when I get asked, well, Beau, why do you care so much about taxes and tax reform? And I don't need a whole lot more motivation other than the 4 kids we have at home that are 10 and under. Because I want our kids, Sean and I's kids, to have the same opportunities that I had. Growing up in agriculture, having the opportunity to start a small business with my brothers, a custom haying operation when we were in high school. You learn a lot, as all of you know. The business environment is challenging. Being involved in state government is challenging. We have a lot of challenges, but we have a lot of opportunities. And I'm very optimistic that we've made some decisions, that we've had wise leadership from the governor on down over the past number of years. I believe that we can find some solutions with what we're talking about with tax reform. I very much look forward to the opportunity here in the coming months to go across the state and to hear from Nebraskans. Because I think that's really what the beauty of our unicameral system is. That the people of Nebraska believe that they really have input on what we do in Lincoln. And they do. And we're going to hear from a lot of Nebraskans as we travel the state on what do they want our tax structure to look like for the next number of decades. Because the reality is what we're talking about now with tax reform and changing our tax structure, finding what is the most modern tax structure possible that still achieves what we need and what we are obligated to do in state government. that opportunity only comes along once or twice in a generation. I'm thankful that I have the opportunity to be here and be a part of this. It's exciting times, I believe, for our state. We positioned ourselves well, and I believe we have the opportunity to really leapfrog ourselves ahead and really say, not only do we believe that we're the best state in the country, but we believe we have the best opportunities here for those in business and those to raise a family. So with that, thank you.
I'm sure you agree with me that this group and the legislature in general, the governor, have taken on a rather monumental task in trying to both evaluate and rework our tax structure so that it makes Nebraska a more competitive state, a more attractive state to be a part of. And I know I speak for the entire business community when I say thank you for the work that they're doing. We do have time for questions. There's 2 microphones out there, and I appreciate people finding their way to them. To get that started, I'm going to go ahead and probably kind of follow up. Senator Hadley kind of opened this discussion a little bit, but I'm going to direct this towards Senator Adams to start with, and then if others want to join in, they certainly may. Senator, next year, there's going to be 17 of your colleagues who will not be allowed to run again because of term limits, and then another 7 that will be running for re-election. So that's about 35% at least of the unicameral that will be turning over. That'll be followed in 2 years by at least another 14 that will be term limited. But in light of that, can the legislature take up something this major tax reform in a way that does not leave future legislators, future lawmakers, or our state in general in some kind of a bind?
That's a load. Well, I'm one of those 17, and I would begin by saying I'm replaceable. It's something I want you to think about, and I've given this a lot of thought in my service in the legislature. It wasn't long ago, I was at a meeting in St. Paul, and I was sitting with a representative from one of our neighboring states, and we were talking about making tax policy, making any policy, education policy, you name it. And we found ourselves agreeing on a lot of things. One of them was that legislatures by their nature tend to be more reactive than proactive. Whatever that reason is for that, and we could go on and on about it, but they do tend to be more reactive than proactive. And what we're looking at here is trying to be more proactive. Barry brought up term limits. Good, bad, or indifferent, 12 years, 8 years, whatever it is, whatever state it's in. Besides the institutional history on these issues that may get watered down and lost, something else gets lost. The ability to take a proactive, long-term view. Taxes or education policy, health policy, you name it. The state demands that we make good policy. There isn't a senator comes into the legislature, I don't believe, that doesn't come in there with the intention of making good policy. But I have 4 years to make it in. But this is too big to get done in 4 years. I use the example of look where we're at with equalization. It goes back to the days of Jerry Warner. And how many years did he serve? How many chairmanships did he hold working towards something? Quite frankly, I think that one of the problems we may have with term limits is the inability of future senators to be more proactive and take a long-term view, be patient, and work towards good policy rather than having to react to things in a short term.
I'd like to make a comment on that. I mentioned the future, and let me give you an example. Nebraska is one of the few states that does not exempt Social Security income or a portion of Social Security income from Nebraska income tax. Actually, Nebraska gives up about $155 million in income because the first $24,000 of a single person's income is exempt and $32,000 from joint is exempt. But let me give you an idea of what we need to look at. If you look at the demographics in the state of Nebraska and you look at 20 years from now, we have about 250,000 people right now that are 65 years of age and older. 20 years from now, they're talking about 350,000 people being 65 or older. So when we're making decisions, we've got to think about what we do today that impacts Nebraska 10, 15, and 20 years later.
Hello. Okay, this is working now. First of all, I want to thank all of you for being here today, and thank you for the governor for his service to the state of Nebraska. I often think about the overwhelming amount of money that I personally pay in federal income taxes, the overwhelming amount of money that my company pays in corporate income taxes, and the smaller amount that I pay personally to the state and that my corporation pays to the state. At the federal level, I see my taxes as a total expense, and in many cases a wasted expense. I might be able to make the argument that my tax here at the local level for the state of Nebraska is an investment and not necessarily an expense. Our tax code at the state level is much simpler. It's easier to understand. And there are a lot of moving parts. But as you work on your committee this summer and into the next legislative session, knowing that we have a surplus, and we should have a surplus for those rainy days when we go through recession. But as Senator Mello has pointed out, the surplus has not changed a whole lot during that time. It's because of what the legislature and the governor have done over the last few years. And I might make the argument that where the surplus is at right now is appropriate, now and in the future. So to simplify this tax conversation, might it be a good idea in the future that at the end of the fiscal year, that if the state has received in more revenue than we needed to fund our budget, why don't we just now start returning that tax money, that revenue, back to the citizens based on what they paid into the system? I'd like your comments.
Well, sorry about that. I'll try to do my best to answer that question. Very, very good and thoughtful question. I've never kind of heard that idea before. In part, I think because Nebraska has a very unique financing mechanism for our cash reserve or our savings account, so to speak, when the state ultimately brings in more revenue after we pass a budget and or forecast that budget of what it's going to cost and what our revenues would be. That additional revenue automatically goes into the cash reserve, which is why this year we saw such an increase in our state's cash reserve, in part due to a one-time $125 million transfer due to an increase in capital gains, which was based essentially on the cliff of the fiscal cliff debate that happened in Washington that ended at the December 31st. So a lot of people sold off stocks. We saw a big rise in capital gains, which we know in economic theory is that we're borrowing that money possibly from the future. That because people made a decision this December 31st to sell stocks and to essentially pay their capital gains now instead of holding on to them longer because they didn't want to pay higher federal capital gains tax, we're borrowing possibly income tax revenue we would get in the future when those stocks would have been sold in a natural progression. So that's something that our forecasting board at the state level took that in consideration. They accounted for it when we transferred that $125 million at the end of the fiscal year to the cash reserve. But to provide a little historical context, we started the Great Recession with a 17.3% cushion in our cash reserve. We drew that down more than half due to the challenges our state went through over the last 4 years. And I'd be remiss not to also remind the audience that the state also received over $500 million in direct assistance from the federal government through the stimulus bill, which I don't think we're ever going to see again. So with the combination of the stimulus and our cash reserve, we've been able to balance budgets without raising taxes and still be able to maintain I believe, a core level of services in K-12, healthcare, and higher education. Your question's a great question, and it's something that we can easily consider moving forward. I think the dilemma you run into, just off the back of my head trying to answer it, is that what happens when we start to spend that cash reserve dollar amount down? Because you gotta look at it as a percentage, not a dollar amount, because we had a lower dollar amount in 2008, but we had higher percentage because our spending growth, the amount the state government was spending was lower at that time historically. So you have to probably look at your answer, or giving you an answer, we'd have to possibly look at a percentage cap, so to speak, of the cash reserve moving forward, not so much a dollar amount.
One of the things inherent in that surplus figure is a guesstimate by the projectors that there's going to be a 5.5% compounded revenue growth. Now, assuming we don't raise taxes, that means nominal GDP has got to go up by 5.5% year after year after year. How many of you are willing to bet on that? I'm way too conservative to bet on that. I don't think we're going to see nominal GDP growth at that for some time. Consequently, we're going to avoid an unhappy situation of maybe having to raise taxes, and most of us have pledged not to raise taxes. We have got to maintain that reserve. I think also for us to experiment with different tax ratios, shifting things to maybe a service-oriented tax or a tax on financial industry or a tax here or there. There's a lot of imaginative things out there. But to experiment with any of them, you risk guessing wrong on the outcome and coming up short. If you come up short, there's only one place you can do, one thing you can do to make up the difference, and that's dip into the reserve. So a strong reserve is healthy not only for the modernization process, it's also healthy for the cyclical process. And man, one of the big shockers, and I understand the reasons for it, that last year, if you looked at the projection, even though they were projecting education spending high and a few other things, they didn't know about the Obama fear tax that was going to happen at the end of the year, where people voluntarily threw in an extra $120 million, was that we were $600 million short. This year, we're $600 million long. You can't run a ship with that kind of uncertainty. And the only way to protect is with strong reserves. Once we get a strong reserve, hey, then that's wonderful, and we can put all kinds of direct cuts in taxes, or some people on the other side of the aisle would say increases in spending out there. But right now, I don't think we're that. I just am not ready to sign off on 5.5% compounded rate of growth in the next few bienniums.
I'd like to make the same comments they were making. But also, someone explained it to me the other day, one of the key reasons for a reserve is not to have to increase taxes when you go through the business cycle. That if you do not have a reserve, you go through the business cycle, your revenues go down, you have two choices: cut spending or raise taxes. The state of Michigan right now has $78 million in their cash reserve. Someone figured that out. That's about 30 minutes of spending in the state of Michigan. When they go down, they have no other ability than to either slash everything or to raise taxes. Now, I think the legislature has to be very diligent that we don't spend the reserve on I hate to use the term feel-good things, but really do preserve it for what it's meant to do.
Nick?
Yeah, Nick Cusick from Lincoln. My question, I think, arises out of my naiveness about the process in the legislature. My question specifically is, given the broad range of backgrounds and opinions of the committee itself, the Tax Modernization Committee, and the input you're getting from the state, is it likely or possible that there'll be any bills that come out of the committee that are signed onto by all of the committee members?
Looking for someone else. You know, you notice when you're leading the troops, when everybody else looks the other way when a question is asked. I think there will be, because I think we all have a sense of what we need to do. There might be questions about how we get there, but I think we'll work through it. We have 14 members on the committee with 14 different backgrounds, 14 different views, 14 different theories. It will be difficult. But I've herded a lot of cats in my life, so herding this committee will probably not, be much different. If you remember President Harding, when he left the presidency of Princeton, he said, to become president of the United States, why are you doing that? He said he wanted to get out of politics. Well, I spent 30 years in the depths of politics at a university, so I hope that helps me in this as we move along.
Pretty quiet. Chad?
Chad Denton, Omaha. So there's a conversation about the modernization and the reality that there may be a surplus, there may not. If we're going to reduce taxes, there have to be measures. We've got property tax, income tax, sales tax. On the income tax side, we're on top rate. Income tax individually, we're at 16. Business, we're at 19 at that top rate. How are you going about factoring and making the decision what's more important if we can reduce taxes, whether it be income tax, property tax, sales tax? How are you making that decision? How are you going about it? Maybe where are you at today with that?
I'll start off and try to give you, I think, a perspective from only being in 4 meetings so far is all we've had. I think we're having good dialogues about looking at everything. I mean, there is some no doubt. I'd be the first to tell you that Nebraska ranks, I believe, second, Governor, in the recent, or second in the recent Polina study of making Nebraska one of the best business climates in the country. So you get information like that as we start a tax modernization committee process, you have to ask yourself, what's actually going wrong, so to speak, in regards to our economy seems to be moving in the right direction. We're getting claims from a variety of different sources around the country. So you have to balance that with the understanding that there's consistent tax, I think, concepts, philosophies, suggestions, bills that we've debated before that are coming back that all of us in the committees we sit on or the subcommittees we sit on are discussing. I think the reality is that members in the subcommittee I sit on with Senator McCoy, Senator Hadley, Senator Har, we're having good conversations. I think we're having a good dialogue of looking at different ideas, looking at different changes. But the reality is those changes do have fiscal impacts. And wearing my appropriations committee hat, I have to be very cognizant of simply making a change here or a change there adds up to $500 million. That's almost all of your cash reserve and/or that's all of the University of Nebraska's budget. I mean, that's, to some extent, that's half of our K-12 funding budget. I mean, you have to be able to weigh a lot of things in your head at the same time as you're looking at tax policy, because it's not simply created in a vacuum. Tax policy is, I think, part of a broader fiscal and economic policy, which is why the legislature and the governor is focused on tax incentives and trying to make our business climate more competitive with tax incentives over the last decade, as well as trying to make key investments. And I would be remiss to not mention key investments in education. The reality is Facebook and Google may not have come to Nebraska not because of our high tax rate for personal income tax, They didn't come for some reasons because of our renewable energy generation, as well as a workforce issue. And those are things that I think we have to be able to have conversations about internally with members as we're discussing tax policy, because everything is interwoven in regards to fiscal tax policy, both on the spending side and on, I would say, any kind of tax modernization changes.
The thing we've heard most about has been property tax. But I have a little concern about this. I'm generally in agreement with the governor. I picked up my property tax form the other day and I looked at it. And there was a consistency about the items that I was charged. School district, city, county, ESU, NRD, community college. The one thing that was consistent about every one of those is I got to vote for the board members of every one of those organizations. I got to mark down who was going to run the city of Kearney, Buffalo County, the school district. A lot of people are concerned about property taxes, but I think you need to be sure that you're asking questions of your local groups. And we hear the story of the city having a budget meeting, the county having a budget meeting, and not one citizen shows up. Not one citizen cares enough to show up to voice their opinion on how things are going. Senator Johans made the comment about sending problems to Washington. You have to be careful about sometimes sending problems to Lincoln. Because if you want Lincoln to pay for things, you better expect Lincoln, the legislature, to want more of a say in how things are run. Does that make sense? If I'm in the legislature and I have to appropriate more aid for these things that property taxes are paid, more of it coming from a statewide level, I want to have more say-so on how things are run. One of the things that we have to be very careful in Nebraska as we go on is the demographic shift of people to the eastern part of Nebraska. If you draw a line down 33rd Street in Lincoln from South Dakota to Kansas, half the people live east of that line now. Half the people live east of that line. So we're getting more and more concerned about that rural-urban split. So we have to be very careful that we don't enter into policies that exacerbate that urban-rural split. Thank you.
For a bunch of very opinionated people, they're kind of quiet, aren't they? Other questions? Sure. Richard?
We have a lot of business members in the audience today that had to make some real difficult decisions during the recession about cutbacks, using innovation, those kinds of things. And Senator Mello, I appreciate your comment on spending and how do we look at that. My bigger question is, how do we adopt what the business leaders did in terms of innovation and efficiency and take that into the public sector as part of this debate? Because we talk a lot about taxation, but you're right, the spending side of that is important. So how do we leverage innovation and efficiency into that process?
Well, that's a great question, Richard, and I think, believe it or not, and I've mentioned this to the governor multiple times over the last couple of years, I think the last budget we went through, there was some pretty good innovations that were undertaken both by the governor and the legislature to help solve roughly $1 billion budget shortfall. There was some consolidation of programs, elimination of programs. There was a variety of different, I would say, programs that got reevaluated, got changed, and are altered to help focus some state spending on different key priorities. I think that's something that we did because we knew we had to do it. We were in a position where no one wanted to raise taxes, but we also wanted to maintain a level of services and invest in certain areas of state government that we felt would help grow our economy and help prepare ourselves for the future. I don't think, just to your question, I think the legislature, and I think different members on the dais and other members in the audience, I think still carry that same perspective. I think that there are always members that are introducing pieces of legislation to evaluate whether or not we need a state agency, whether or not we can consolidate a state agency, whether or not programs are meeting their intended focus, both from the legislative perspective and the executive side. No doubt government is not the same thing as a for-profit corporation. They have different perspectives and different outcomes and different goals and missions. But there are some very good management techniques, very good long-term planning techniques that the business community uses that the state government could easily adopt. And I think something other states have done is they've gone through blue ribbon commissions to explore ways to reinvent or redesign certain parts of state government. I think something that you may see in the upcoming legislative session is a way to have to look and reinvent and redesign our correction system. I continue to bring that issue up because it's such a looming issue. And it's an issue that we've not really talked about in the legislature the past 5 years, because when we pass bills that create stiffer sentences, we haven't had the conversation of what happens when those stiffer sentences lead to more people being incarcerated and ultimately filling up the state's correction facility. And so those are the kinds of conversations that are going to require us to be more innovative, I think, to actually have some very tough dialogue about what do we want to do to make sure the state's innovative and meeting the needs that Nebraskans want.
Well, I think one of the reasons America was so successful in its first 200 years, and why, in fact, these parts of the country were settled, it was because it had no past to haunt it. Think about that. How many of you, knowing what we know now, with the technology that we have now, would design Nebraska in the same way that it's designed? Would you lay out 530-some towns, 93 counties? Would you deploy our highway and other resources the way we are now? Most likely that design would look very, very different if we could start from scratch. It was designed well for the time it was. 7 miles apart, little town, have a water and coal place to load up the train and move on. Best you could do. It was proper. But how many of you would design it that way today? And to a large extent, government is handicapped by our past at this time. And it's really hard for government to break from that model. Much easier for a business to say, let's close a plant, than for somebody to say, let's close a town. Can't do it. And so somehow in this transformation that we have got to go through to become modern, we've got to figure out at what point should the government stop deploying resources for the preservation of the past and start wondering how we can deploy resources for the optimization of the future.
You know, I'd add to that being involved in business outside of being involved in the legislature, I think one of the things that I think is sometimes difficult is when we all as business people make decisions in our organizations, we make them in a dynamic way. We make a decision, we move forward, and you live with the consequences, good or bad. It's a little more challenging than that in government. But that buy-in from the business community, that buy-in from Nebraskans is really what we need as we go forward in this process. You know, I don't think that the collective wisdom on tax policy is sitting on this stage, with no disrespect to any of my colleagues. I think we'd all say that to a person, because it really requires a team effort here. You know, and that's where I think the chambers do a great job in how they represent their members and other organizations that come to us at the Capitol. But when we get in the grind of a session, it's very difficult sometimes to be innovative and think of ingenious, new, creative strategies to get something done. That's why we're doing what we're doing now, when we're not in regular session. That's the important process. We need to hear from you. We need to hear what your ideas are. They come from all different directions, good ideas and innovative solutions. And there are maybe things that you do in business that might work for what we're attempting to do or would like to do in government. They may not always work. They may not always be able to coexist. But there are definitely good ideas out there that we need to hear from, and we need that feedback in order to make this successful and to really get to that point, which I think we want to get to, which is the maximum amount of good for our citizens across the state. We think we can get there.
Just one last comment, and I don't mean to hog all the discussion. We have a link on the Nebraska Legislature website on the Modernization Committee that we have a lot of reports and such as that. And one that I'll make sure is put up. It's a report that we show what's happened 20 years ago versus now in both where the revenue comes from in Nebraska and where the expenditures. And the largest decline in percentage of budget is in administration of government in Nebraska. We're doing a reasonable job in declining the percentage of the budget that it takes to administer Nebraska. The largest increase, 10% increase over the last 20 years of the budget is aid to individuals. The largest part is Medicaid payments.
Any others? Senator Schumacher triggered a thought, and my problem is I'm not sure I can formulate it into a question, but I'll share the thought, and perhaps some senators will respond to it. I was just last week at a meeting, Council of State Manufacturers Association, and one of our speakers was a rather renowned economist who shared a piece of information that I just hadn't thought of, I guess, or I'm sure it's very well, maybe it's well-known information, I just hadn't thought of it. Of all the states, and there's a lot of comparison of taxes between states through a lot of various studies, but of all the states in America who have no income tax, all but one, Alaska, which is an unusual situation, but all but one have never had an income tax. So they've found other ways to fund essential services from their state government without ever instigating or initiating an income tax. I guess the point is that states do need to find ways to provide those essential services, and obviously changes need to be made. It always needs to be evaluations, but it's kind of hard to compare Nebraska to a Texas to a Florida. They've found other ways to do that without ever having an income tax. Obviously, the state chamber does want to see those rates become more competitive so that we can compete better in a global economy. But like I say, I'm not sure I could get a question into that, but if there's any thought along that line on how Nebraska best governs and provides those services, I challenge you to share that thought.
I'll take a shot at it. I don't think what we're going to see in the next decade or so is any radical change in tax mechanisms. However, I think if we're smart, we'd start thinking about, maybe it has to come from a national level, maybe it can come locally, how the new economy works. I asked a question of one of the economic gurus that talked to us in the last couple days about why do we tax real property? If I want to get rich quick and I want to buy a section of land and watch it go up like it has been for the last few years, I get taxed real property. But if I'm wrong and I bet on gold, I don't get a tax. Don't tax my gold bar, tax my section of farmland. Why is that? And the answer was, well, it's easy to catch, can't hide the farmland, and you can't take it to another state with you. It's stuck here. And so that kind of tells me that the reason that's one of our oldest taxes is because those are principles to look at, and because our economy at one time was strongly founded in that, and that's the way life was. Today, flows of money flows of credit are what mark the economy. They are the land of the modern economy. So how can we do something where we can peel off a small sliver of those rivers and fund some of our government functions? And we can't do it today because we don't have the computers, but with the NSA having developed a lot of nifty things for watching just about everything, maybe one day we will. And one of the more painless of the taxes is one that is a tiny amount of a large stream. And so we got to figure out how to tax the economy, the land of the future. And that's 15, 20 years out. But I think if we're smart, we'll ask some of our gurus and keep that as a topic in the legislature as to how we develop a truly modern tax mechanism that is fair and truly monitors what people are taking out of the economy, what they owe back to the economy in taxes, and do all that without being too hard on the poor guy who goes out and waits tables. Thank you.
Any others? Sir, Corinne?
The last, oops, where are we at here? It's there. Corinne Peterson, NMPP Energy. The last 2 days, we've had a group of new economic developers, some only on the job for like 3 weeks, some 3 months, some 5 months, and 2 or 3 of them come from outside Nebraska. And what they told us was, it's hard to recruit when the surrounding states, 3 of those people were in border communities. 2 of them bordered up against Colorado. Another one bordered up against Colorado and Wyoming. And the others were Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, and one of them even bordered into Missouri just a little bit. And their tax structure was different. And she said, one of them said, it's hard to say to them, how do you compete? How does Nebraska compete with those other states? So as the committee, are you looking at what other states that surround us? Senator Schumacher brought up our borders, and we have communities that are facing those borders next door to other states. So are you looking at how they are doing their tax structure and perhaps changing their ways?
Question. We consistently hear in the Revenue Committee, on most every bill we hear, that they do it a different way in Kansas, or they do it a different way in Iowa, or they do it a different way in South Dakota, so we should change. Well, we do look at that, but Nebraska has a lot of pluses also. We forget the good things we have. I'll pick on Missouri for a minute. Do you want to move to St. Louis and send your children to St. Louis, Missouri school system? Do you want to send your schools to Kansas City, Missouri school system that until recently was under federal control? We try hard to be competitive. We call it border bleed. You try to be competitive, but you also try to sell what you have. If you look at the number of Advantage Act firms that have not fulfilled their part of the agreement yet, we get those numbers. I don't know, it's like the potential of $500 million in tax credits and about 200,000 new jobs. Some people sit there and say, that's just terrible. I'd love to have every one of those firms fulfill their contract. I'd love 200,000 more people in Nebraska right now. 200,000 more trained workers in Nebraska. One of our biggest concerns, and I think Senator Schumacher talked about it, we got about 1.8 million people, and we got a big state. And that's tough. So yes, other states do things differently, and we try hard to match them. But let me give you an example. South Dakota taxes food. Do we tax food? Iowa doesn't tax food. Kansas taxes food a little bit. Colorado allows each of their counties to decide what the base is for what you tax in Colorado for sales tax. So how do you pick out who you're going to compete against? I'll tell you an area that I think is important. We keep hearing a lot from our implement dealers that we're losing a lot to our surrounding states because we put a sales tax on ag repair parts. And we'll probably hear a bill this coming year, I know we will, to try and get our ag dealers more competitive with their counterparts in the other areas. But it is difficult to figure out what you're going to compete with other states with.
I think that the point that you're making is absolutely a valid one. And virtually everything we do in state government, I find anyway, we catch ourselves hanging our neck on the other side of the fence to see how the other guy's doing it. And there's value in that because it confirms sometimes that we're doing it right, and it also tells us we need to make changes. And Senator Hadley's right. In my service on the Revenue Committee, there was hardly a bill that came before the committee that we didn't ask ourselves, what's Iowa do? What's Kansas do? So the question that you ask is a very valid one. But let me throw something else out. And this will probably come as no surprise to any of you. And those of you in the business world may be able to validate this or not. It was at a meeting last summer, and two CEOs of major national companies were talking to state legislators about how do they decide what state to expand into. And I was a little taken back by the response. I really was. Because I went in there expecting to hear about taxes. And what I heard about was labor force, and education of labor force, and ability to educate labor force, and heard it from both CEOs. And finally, a little ways into the conversation, a senator from someplace just stood up and asked the question, well, what about tax incentives? Both of them said, tax incentives are on their list, but they're not at the top. And part of the reason they're not at the top, at least this was their response, is almost every state's got them. So we're looking for other things, and once we find those things, then we'll start to narrow down further based on the tax situation that we see, or we'll groom our business model to whatever the tax environment is in that state if they have other assets that outweigh it. Taxes are part of it, but obviously community colleges, K-12, university, quality of life, all of those things figure into it. I was the mayor of York for 10 years. We had the lowest property tax rate of any first-class city in the state. And I can't tell you how many times I kicked the dirt walking outside of my office saying, we can't get this company to come here. There was something more. They were intrigued by our taxes, but there was something more that was missing.
One of the many projects I start and never finish was one a couple of years ago, which I still think would be interesting to do. And that was to contact the 8 Ivy League schools and ask them how many of their students were from Nebraska. And what I found out is that each of them had about 8 in their undergraduate programs. And the next step, which I didn't do, but still would be interesting to do, would be to get those 64 kids together. And instead of us speculating why they aren't coming back to Nebraska, and most likely most of them won't be, Ask them. Maybe they know. And how many of you think that the ones that would say, I'm not coming back to Nebraska, say, you know, we studied the state income tax rates? That ain't the reason. We've got a more complex problem than passing a bill on tax rates. We need to ask them what it is. I think the answers would be very interesting. And that may be something we ought to do.
Okay, we're going to need to make this the last question. Nick?
Since the conversation that you're having is not about next year's tax policy, but long-term, down-the-road tax policy, I have a question relative to internet sales. Currently, we certainly know that there's a lot of leakage in the sales tax side based on internet sales, and I would only assume that that's going to continue. Is that an issue that the state can do anything about, or does it require federal legislation and action? Of course, we all know that you should be paying use tax on that, but I doubt if anybody in this room, when they buy a shirt online, that pays a use tax on it. But ask if there's something the state can do to stop that leakage, or whether it's a federal issue.
I'd take a shot at that. There is a line on your Nebraska tax return where you're supposed to put down how much you bought online and you multiply it. I did, because I'm a politician and I didn't want somebody looking at that line and saying you didn't buy anything online. So you put down $1,000 and you pay an extra $70 in taxes, and it's called the Main Street Act, I believe it's called. I think we need it. We have small towns, large towns in Nebraska that have businesses that are competing with online competitors, and it's hard for them to compete when you might have a 7% differential in prices just because of taxes. I'll use an example that I have in Kearney, Nebraska. It's the Buckle. Great business. I would guess the Buckle's probably 35 to 38 states they're in. I'm going to impress you that make you think I'm a lawyer. I'm really not. But they have nexus in 38 states. So that means that they pay, if they have an internet order that goes to any of those 38 states, they're required to collect sales tax for that state. They sell a lot of the same things that Amazon does. Amazon does not have nexus in a number of those states and doesn't have to collect the sales tax. You are supposed to do the use tax. And I have to only laugh because we've heard the farm implement bill. I talked about the sales tax. It's always kind of fun to watch the farmer that comes in and talks about them going to Kansas to buy farm parts. And I mentioned to them that they're supposed to fill out that use tax form. And they start shuffling their feet at that point in time at the witness stand and say that they're done talking at that point in time. Especially when one of my colleagues says, you know, that's tax evasion. I'd like to see it. It's a federal problem. I want to see it just to level the playing field for Nebraska businesses.
Okay. I think if you did not come here believing, I think you will agree by now that we do indeed have some very dedicated and worthy public servants serving in our unicameral. They do take their job extremely seriously, and it is more than just a 3 or 6 month a year job. They dedicate themselves the entire year, if not in Lincoln, but through constituent service and working back in their district. So would you please help me thank the panel here today for spending their time with us.